Okay. I've been asked to go over limited English proficiency and the new guidance that came out in January about emotional support animals, assistance animals, service animals, and I'm sure y'all have a lot of questions about all of that. So if at any point you have a question, just unmute yourself and just interrupt me and ask. So we're going to start with LEP and just, a picture of the state of Texas so you can see just where the concentrations of LEP persons are throughout the state. Now, an LEP person is an individual who doesn't speak English as their primary language or has a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. And LEP persons constitute about 9% of the population, and that is just growing. Between 1990 and 2010, that 20-year period, it was an 80% growth in that population, and it's only going to continue upward. So the top 10 languages, number one obviously is Spanish, and then Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Tagalog. Those are all Asian languages. They're concentrated in different parts of the country. I'm in New Orleans, so we have a large number of Vietnamese speakers here. And you can see that Texas is the second state in terms of LEP population, second only to California, and just the number of LEP persons in the state. And as you can see, the LEP population is growing. And so we're going to start to see more concentrations of LEP persons in different states throughout the country. Here in Louisiana, where I am, after Hurricane Katrina, we had a large number of LEP persons come to the state where we had not had that big of a population prior to the storm. So the law that applies to the LEP requirements is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And Title VI prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. So obviously it's the national origin prong that applies to LEP persons. So Title VI applies to any individual, any entity that receives federal financial assistance. So if you receive money from HUD, then we are going to be we can accept complaints filed based on LEP discrimination. We can do compliance reviews based on LEP issues. All of that would be done under Title VI. Sorry. And so the Title VI regulations that would apply to what you folks do is 24 CFR 1.4, and that makes it illegal to deny any housing accommodations, facilities, etc., to any protected individual for any program or activity that receives federal funding. So denying housing, accommodations, services, denying an opportunity to participate in a program, or using any kinds of rules, processes, procedures that would serve to exclude members of that population. What also applies here in addition to Title VI is Executive Order 13166. And that executive order directed all federal agencies to really work hard to ensure that LEP persons have meaningful access to the programs that we fund. So the idea is we don't want our funding to be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the civil rights laws and regulations. So the big piece of guidance that applies to LEP is the final guidance to federal financial assistance recipients. regarding Title VI. So this is what lays out what all the requirements are for any recipients of federal financial assistance. What obligation you have to LAP persons, how you make a determination as to what your obligations are. All of that is laid out in this guidance. And it's 13 years old. This guidance came out back in 2007. So what the gist of the guidance is that if you receive federal financial assistance, you're required to take reasonable steps to ensure meaningful access to whatever program is being funded and whatever activity is being funded. So meaningful access to LEP persons. So how do you make a determination as to what constitutes a reasonable effort to ensure meaningful access? Well, making that determination is very fact specific. That's why the guidance is really designed to help walk you through the analysis to see exactly what your obligations are and what kinds of steps you would have to take depending on your situation. So the idea is that there has to be balance between ensuring meaningful access, but also not imposing an undue burden, financial or administratively, on small businesses, small local governments, or small nonprofit organizations. The idea is not for you to have to expend unlimited resources on serving this population. The idea is that you do you take meaningful steps, but not steps that would impose an undue financial burden on your organization. So recipient obligations are to conduct a 4-factor analysis. And this is just the starting point of what you have to do. The 4-factor analysis has to be conducted. Then you develop a language access plan, which will determine how you're going to serve the LEP population. And you have to provide appropriate language assistance. So your housing provider, you are going to conduct this 4-factor analysis to determine, do you need to translate your leases? How much of your leases have to be translated? Do you need to provide translation services? Do all of your documents need to be translated into a particular language? How do you make the determination as to which languages would apply to you? The guidance is designed to help you answer all of those questions. So here's the 4-factor analysis in a nutshell. What are the number of eligible LEP persons in your jurisdiction? How many people who qualify as LEP persons, who meet that definition that we talked about before, are in your jurisdiction, and what languages do they speak? And what is the frequency with which your program or your entity is going to come into contact with those individuals? If those individuals are not looking for affordable housing, let's say, if the data doesn't show that, maybe that makes some changes as to what your obligations are. The nature and importance of the program, activity, or service provided to people's lives. And the last thing is the resources available to the recipient of that federal financial assistance and the cost of serving this LEP population. All of those things are considerations that you would take in order to determine what your obligations are and how you're going to serve this population. So a language access plan, obviously the first thing that you have to do is identify the language assistance that's needed. Do people need in-person translation services? For HUD, because our agency is so large, we have a contract with a translation service. So if somebody who speaks a language that nobody on staff speaks, we can call this line and request a translator for a particular language. Somebody who only speaks Russian comes in, we can get a translator on the phone who speaks Russian, etc. So identify the ways in which language assistance will be provided. So how are you going to provide that assistance? Are you going to use a phone service like HUD uses? That might be cost prohibitive for what you do. So Perhaps there's a nonprofit organization that serves the LEP population, and you can come to some arrangement where they will help you provide translation services to the population that you serve. Plan on effective outreach to the LEP community. So perhaps you have brochures or you're doing advertising, etc. Are you doing it in those languages that the LEP population in your jurisdiction is speaking? So is that outreach that you're doing reaching LEP persons? Is your staff properly trained? Does your staff know what to do when somebody who speaks a language that they don't speak comes into your office? Do they know what is in that plan? They know who to call, what resources to take advantage of. And finally, plan to translate informational materials in identified languages. So, for example, here in New Orleans, the main languages that we have to do translation services for: Spanish, French, and Vietnamese. So we expect our grantees here to have materials available in those 3 languages and to have developed relationships with organizations who may be able to provide translation services, etc., to them so that they can serve that population. Also, a plan to provide translated notices to LEP persons. So let's say you house an LEP person and they're late on their rent. Is the notice that you're providing to them about the rent, or a notice that you're providing that someone is coming to spray for pests, is that notice provided to them in a language that they can understand? Plan to provide interpreters for large, medium, small, and one-on-one meetings. So if you are having a big community meeting where you're announcing something, are you going to have translation services available at that meeting so that LEP persons can get the information that they need? And as I said earlier, developing community resources, partnerships, and other relationships to help with the provision of LEP services. I'm sure many of you are dealing with limited resources that get more limited by the day. So developing relationships with churches, with advocacy organizations, community groups who can help you serve this population are great ways for you to build those connections and relationships and serve that population at little to no cost. Where interpretation is needed and is a reasonable service to provide, recipients should consider hiring bilingual staff, excuse me, hiring staff interpreters, contracting for interpreters or phone interpretation services, using community volunteers, or allowing family members or friends to provide translation services. So let's say, for example, you're meeting with someone and normally you would only meet with them one-on-one, allowing them to bring a family member, excuse me, or a friend to help them. Where you normally would not allow somebody to be in that meeting would be a way of accommodating the LEP person. Excuse me. Vital documents that are those documents that are critical for ensuring meaningful access by beneficiaries or potential beneficiaries. So any document that creates or defines a legally enforceable right or responsibility, anything soliciting information required to establish or maintain eligibility. So recertification documents for Section 8 would be an example of that. And it can be any or all of a document. So it may be that part of a document is just filling in numbers or putting the person's name. It's not necessary to translate the whole thing, but to translate the most important parts of the document so that the LEP person has all of the vital information that they need. Now, translation services for leases. The guidance recommends that when a lease is translated into another language other than English, that the recipient only asks the tenant to sign the lease written in English. and that the translated document be provided to the tenant but marked for information only. That's because we're talking about a contract, and it's better to have that done in English. And so that's what the guidance directs. Now, safe harbor is considered strong evidence of compliance with the recipient's written translation obligations. So written translations of vital documents for each LEP language group constituting 5% of the eligible population, or 1,000, whichever is less, with a minimum of 50 people. The great thing about the guidance is that there's a chart at the end, which really lays out how you do the calculations of the eligible LEP language groups. So how would you calculate whether or not there's something that you need to be providing, or whether or not you have a safe harbor? I would again point you to the guidance to help you figure that out. So, any questions about LEP before we move into service and emotional support animals? Okay, I'm going to move into service animals and emotional support animals now. Now, the guidance calls both of these categories of animals, emotional support animals and assistance, and service animals, assistance animals. And so what my goal is today is to help you be able to distinguish the requirements for service animals and for other assistance animals. And because what the requirements are for each of those categories of animals is very different, and what laws apply is different. So the new notice that I talked about coming out in January of this year provides step-by-step guidance on how housing providers need to assess a request for a reasonable accommodation to have an assistance animal. And then the second part of the guidance is about documentation. What documentation should you require from the person in order to make a determination of whether or not to grant the accommodation or to deny it? So the assistance animals, which includes two categories, service animals, emotional support animals, are animals that do work, perform tasks, and or provide therapeutic emotional support for individuals with disabilities. They are not pets. So you can't charge a pet deposit for service, emotional support, assistance animals. They are not considered pets under the law. So multiple laws may apply depending on the situation, and the Fair Housing Act applies to just about all housing, regardless of whether it is funded by the government or not. So Fair Housing Act would apply in almost every situation. There are a few exemptions from Fair Housing Act, but they're very limited. And for housing providers like all of you, you would not be exempt. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1974 applies to all programs or activities conducted by recipients of federal financial assistance. The Americans with Disabilities Act applies to public entities. Okay, but remember that the ADA applies to public accommodations. It does not apply to an individual's apartment. A lot of times, I'm sure you've encountered this already. You'll have a tenant or a potential tenant, they conflate the ADA. They might say the ADA requires you let them have an iguana in their apartment. It does not. Okay, we're going to get into the differences between the ADA and the Fair Housing Act in a second. Now, HUD is responsible for enforcing the Fair Housing Act. So the division that I work for, Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, that is our responsibility. We enforce the Fair Housing Act so people can file complaints with us when they think that their rights have been violated. And we also ensure compliance with all civil rights related requirements by recipients of our money. So that applies specifically to HUD's money. So if you receive money from us, then we're going to be checking for compliance with all of the civil rights related requirements by you. DOJ, the U.S. Department of Justice, is responsible for enforcing the Americans with Disabilities Act. So occasionally we have had situations where somebody will file a complaint with us. We will conduct an investigation, usually involving Section 504. And we'll confer with our attorneys and we'll end up adding, depending on the allegations and depending on what we find, adding Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's relatively rare that we do that. Because as I said, we don't, and HUD is really not responsible for public accommodations outside of those accommodations that a housing provider would have. So for example, your leasing office, your community room, any public opportunity, accommodation, facility that you have that is not an individual's apartment or house, but the community room. Okay. So as I said, assistance animals is a very broad term, and it encompasses two categories of animals. Service animals are covered by the ADA, and the ADA has a very narrow definition of a service animal. Then there are also other animals who perform tasks, who actually have a job, okay? So a seeing eye dog is probably the best example that everyone is familiar with. The dog has training, the dog does a job. There are also some miniature horses, some monkeys that are also trained to perform specific tasks for individuals with a disability. Those are working animals, sorry. The difference here is the other category is everything else, right? Animals that don't have any training, they don't do anything except be animals. Dogs who don't have any training, cats who don't have any training, turtles, fish, rabbits, etc., who don't do anything except perhaps provide emotional comfort, usually to people who have a mental disability. Okay, so we're going to walk through how you can use the notice to help you make decisions about how to run your programs. Now, service animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act. As I said, service animal is a very specific thing. It's defined under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Think about, again, like I said, a seeing eye dog that is helping a blind person cross the street, and that person can bring on the bus, bring into City Hall to go vote, bring into the grocery store. That's a service animal. So a service animal, as defined by the Department of Justice, is any dog that is individually trained to work and do tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability. Only applies to dogs. So if you have a miniature horse that's trained, doesn't matter, ADA doesn't apply. If you have a monkey that is trained to perform tasks, doesn't matter, the ADA does not cover that animal. And the work or the tasks that the dog performs have to be directly related to the person's disability. So the ADA does not apply to emotional support animals, comfort animals, animals who help people with their well-being or provide companionship. Okay. So you might be familiar with seeing people bringing their dogs and other animals into public spaces, into the grocery store, into City Hall, into other public spaces. They don't have any protections under the ADA to do that, regardless of whether their dog has a cute little vest on or something that says emotional support animal or service animal. If it's not a dog that is trained, it's not covered by the ADA. So, is the animal a service animal? This one's really easy. Is it a dog? Is it trained? Okay, those are the two levels of inquiry. So if it's a dog, then you go to the next level of inquiry. Is it apparent that the dog is it a CNI dog? Do you have a blind person in front of you and a dog on a harness, and it's clear what the dog's job is? If that's the case, you conclude that it's a service animal, and you don't do any further inquiry. You don't ask any questions. The person doesn't have to provide you with any documentation. It's a service animal. If, for example, though, it's a dog that's trained to sense when somebody with epilepsy is about to have a seizure and it's not immediately apparent what the dog does, you can make a limited inquiry. So, is the animal required because of a disability? And what work has the animal been trained to perform? You can't ask any other questions. If the person says yes to question one and tells you what work the animal has been trained to perform. Remember, we're still talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. We haven't made it to the Fair Housing Act yet. Okay, reasonable accommodation requests for other assistance animals. Now, this I'm sure is what you're most familiar with as housing providers. Somebody comes to you, they say, I have a disability. A lot of times they don't come to you on the front end. They don't ask permission, they ask forgiveness. So it's only when you discover that they have an animal that they tell you that they need a reasonable accommodation. We see that all the time. So housing providers are required to grant reasonable accommodations for assistance animals. So reasonable accommodations must be made for individuals with disabilities who are applicants, tenants, residents, their family members, their children, whoever's living with them, other persons associated with those residents. And a reasonable accommodation may be requested before or after the assistance animal is acquired. And this is discussed in the guidance. And the great thing about the guidance, because this is probably the thing I get questions about more so than anything else, is this assistance animal issue. The guidance really gives you a lot of frequently asked questions and helps guide you in what kind of inquiry to make for a situation like this. Okay, here are the elements of proof. So these are the things, if somebody comes to me and says, Mary, housing provider, deny me a reasonable accommodation to have my assistance animal. These are the things that that individual would have to prove and that the evidence would have to show. The person does in fact have a disability, and the housing provider knew or should have known that the complainant is a person with a disability. That means the person has an obvious disability. They walk with a cane, they're in a wheelchair, they're blind, they're clearly hearing impaired. That's how you meet that knew or should have known. We don't expect you to be able to read anyone's mind. So if the disability isn't readily apparent, we don't expect you to just know that if the person hasn't told you that they have a disability. So the complainant requested an accommodation to the rules, practices, services of the respondent. They don't have to say, I need a reasonable accommodation. They can say, I have a disability and my dog makes me feel better, and so I need it. That's a reasonable accommodation request. The requested accommodation is necessary to afford the complainant an equal opportunity to use and enjoy the dwelling. And the housing provider refused the request, or they took so long to make a decision that it resulted in basically a denial. So if somebody requests a reasonable accommodation and it takes you a month to get back to them, you've denied their request. Okay, assessing whether or not the person has a disability. Now, under the Fair Housing Act, a disability has to substantially limit one or more major life activities. So, a mental illness that might prevent someone from working or going outside or interacting with other people, some kind of mobility issue. All of these things are impairments that affect one or more major life activity. So observable versus non-observable disabilities. Because remember, a lot of times, particularly the people who are asking for accommodations for assistance animals, they don't necessarily have an observable disability. If they have a mental disability, it may not be immediately obvious. Sometimes it is obvious that a person is dealing with a mental disability, often it's not. So if somebody is in a wheelchair and they say, I need this dog in order to help me get around or to help me navigate through doors or something like that, there's no reason to do any further inquiry. You can look at the person and you can see that they are disabled. If not, you can ask them for some supporting documentation to just establish that they are a person with a disability. So this does not mean asking them for details about their disability. What you're trying to establish is whether or not they have a disability, and that's it. Not get into the details of what that disability is, beyond what you need to know in order to assess whether or not there's a connection between what they're asking you for and their disability. So you can ask for information that supports that the animal works, that the animal has some therapeutic benefit for the person. You can ask for that kind of documentation because there has to be what we call in the law a nexus between what they're asking for and their disability. So we've seen all kinds of assistance animals over the years. Our former regional director always would tell a story about a lady who had a horse, and not a miniature one, like a full-size horse in an apartment. I don't even know how that was possible. So, I'm not saying that that's reasonable in any way, shape, or form. But there are people who have snakes. There are people who have ferrets, like all kinds of animals. It can be a very individual thing, like what animal provides comfort and emotional support to someone. And it may not make sense to us, but it doesn't have to. So animals that are not normally kept in households, that just because it's not normally something that someone would have in their home, it's not a reason to deny it. That's not enough of a reason. So the person asking for the accommodation has to show a therapeutic need for that specific type of animal. So if they're asking for something that you think is unreasonable, they really have the burden of showing that it has to be that type of animal or that breed of animal. Okay, examples of when a unique animal may be necessary is when an animal is trained to do work or perform tasks that can't be performed by a dog. Or a person is allergic to a dog. Or if the animal that's not normally kept in the household is something that the person is going to keep outside in a fenced area and is going to properly maintain it. But it's really something you'll want to assess on a case-by-case basis. And just keep in mind that it's called reasonable accommodation for a reason. You don't have to grant every request, and we don't expect you to. We see a lot of unreasonable requests every day. So the key is just really knowing how to make determinations as to the reasonableness of what someone is asking you for. So here's an example of an atypical animal, so a capuchin monkey that can perform tasks for somebody who is paralyzed because of a spinal cord injury. So they can retrieve water and unscrew the cap. They can switch lights on and off and get stuff from cabinets that are up high. So for someone combined to a wheelchair, these are all tasks that a dog can't perform for them. So they can demonstrate a need for this specific type of animal. Okay, other considerations. And I'm gonna speed it up a little because I want to give you time to ask questions. Now, if somebody is asking for an animal that you have determined poses a direct threat to the health and safety of other residents or other people, that's not an accommodation that you have to grant. So we've seen cases where somebody has a breed of dog that is notorious for being aggressive. And that in and of itself is not a reason to deny a particular breed. However, the owner allowed the dog to roam off leash, and there were several elderly women who lived in his community, and he would get out of his car with his unleashed dog, and the dog would scare these elderly residents, and in a couple of instances chase them. That's a direct threat, and he's not entitled to keep that dog on the property. Okay, types of reasonable accommodations. If you have a no pet policy, or if you have breed restrictions, weight restrictions, that kind of thing, or limitations on the number of animals, all of these things, if you charge a pet deposit, somebody asking you to waive the pet deposit or waive your no pet policy or allow them to have a Rottweiler, even though there's a breed restriction in your policies. All of those are reasonable accommodation requests. There are some jurisdictions where they've banned particular breeds of dog in the jurisdiction. We have several towns in Louisiana where they ban pit bulls in the town. So that becomes a little tricky because the housing provider is in a space where it's like, well, do I grant this accommodation and violate the local ordinance, or what do I do? Okay, and also reasonable accommodations must be granted to no animals in common areas. But again, reasonableness is key here. So if people don't control their animals, if they don't pick up after their animals, all of those things they're required to do. And you can hold them accountable. If the animal damages the property, they're responsible for that. Okay, documentation guidance really quickly. In some circumstances, you can ask for additional information that will help you make a determination as to whether or not the person requires the accommodation that they're asking for. And the number one thing that we see is letters from doctors or letters from social workers, counselors. We see those all the time. That's the number one thing that we see. And these letters don't talk specifically about an individual's diagnosis, only that they are a person with a disability and they need what they're asking for. Now, are there doctors and other healthcare professionals who will write these letters for people, even if it's not true? Yes, they will. But getting into assessing whether or not the doctor's statement is accurate and true is really not somewhere that you want to go. Okay, the second section of the guidance gives you some help in figuring out what information you should be asking for in your documentation. You don't have to use a form. You can't require that the resident or the prospective tenant use a particular form or make their request in a certain way. It doesn't have to be notarized. It doesn't have to be signed under penalty of perjury. It doesn't have to disclose their diagnosis. None of those things. And I see the comments. I promise you, I'm almost done. And I'll get to everybody's questions. Okay. So what you want to see on whatever documentation that you get in support of the person's reasonable accommodation request is something that has their name on it and something that establishes a relationship between the healthcare provider, the counselor, and the individual. People can go on the internet and buy these letters. We have seen that, where they live in one city and here's a letter from somebody in another state asking, saying that the person needs a reasonable accommodation. It's pretty clear that the person has never examined the individual, doesn't have any firsthand knowledge of their disability status. So what you really want to see is, let's see, sorry. You don't want to ask for a person's diagnosis. You don't want to ask about the severity of their diagnosis. You don't want to ask for medical records. You don't want to ask for independent evaluation. I've actually seen that in housing authorities admissions and continued occupancy plan, where they actually say, if we don't believe your doctor's note, we can have you examined by our own doctor. No, 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 no. That's not something you ever want to do. Okay, documentation from the internet. As I said before, their websites, I'm sure you've seen them all. They sell certificates, registration, licenses, cute little vests, tags, all kinds of stuff. And just know there's no legitimate organization that is certifying emotional support animals. So if somebody comes in with a certificate and they come in, the dog has a cute little orange vest on that says emotional support animal on it, it really doesn't mean anything. So what you're looking for is documentation from a healthcare provider that shows that there's a relationship between them. Now, I'm sure, I don't know about you, but during COVID, I've had telemedicine appointments with doctors on my phone. There are doctors I have a relationship with, though. So there are a lot of counselors who are meeting with people online and who can attest to whether or not somebody needs a reasonable accommodation. So you don't want to just reject it because it wasn't in person. You need to really be assessing, does the person asking for the accommodation have any personal connection with the individual who wrote this letter? Is this somebody who's treating them? Is this somebody who knows about their condition? So is it anybody with some firsthand knowledge of the requester's situation? If it's not, then you can inquire further. And you absolutely can say that a certificate that somebody purchased from the internet is insufficient. And several months, I think it was last year, Secretary Carson sent a letter to the Federal Trade Commission asking them to look into these websites that sell these fake certifications and registrations and licensing documents to people, because it really undermines the validity of real people who have disabilities who are entitled to an accommodation. It makes everybody doubt legitimate requests for a reasonable accommodation. Okay, let me go to the chat. If I can figure this out, bear with me, y'all. Yes, I can share the slides with everyone. I will make sure that they get to you. Okay. If we've already verified that the person has a disability for medical deductions, will that be all we need? Yes. If somebody gets SSDI, if you already, you know how difficult it is to establish the Social Security Administration that you have a disability. So if somebody has already been determined to be a person with a disability by the Social Security Administration, that is enough. Now, that doesn't help you in terms of what they're asking for, but that absolutely establishes that they are a person with a disability. You would then have to do some analysis about what they're asking for. So you may know that they have SSDI, but if they're asking you for a service animal, it's not enough to say, I get SSI. You need something, there has to be a connection between the person's disability and what they're asking you for. Okay, is a person with a disability allowed to have more than one service animal? Yes. Now, they would have to make the request. So let's say you allow, your policy is 1 dog, 1 cat, and they have 2 cats or 3 cats. That's a reasonable accommodation that you should consider. Do further inquiry. Is there a reason why they need 3? And is there a reason why 1 is not enough? Part of what you should do when somebody asks for a reasonable accommodation is engage in what we call the interactive process. So let's say they ask you for something completely unreasonable. Ask them, okay, tell them I can't do that, but what about if I did this? So you can engage in the interactive process. Let's say if somebody says, I have 3 cats. And you say, why do you need 3 and not 1? Can you have 1? Can you have 2 instead of 3? That would be engaging in the interactive process so that hopefully you guys can meet in the middle. But there's no reason why, just because the person has 2 or 3 instead of 1, that you just deny the reasonable accommodation request for that reason alone. That's what can get you into trouble. Now, if somebody has 12 cats, I would question whether or not that was reasonable, because you do have other residents to take into consideration as well as the maintenance of your property. What if the resident can't care for the animal, such as cleaning up after it in the yard? Are they required to clean or have it cleaned if they are physically unable? Yes. They have to be able to maintain the animal. The reasonable accommodation is you allow them to have the animal. It's not reasonable to expect you then to send your staff out to pick up the poop. They're responsible for that, just as if their animal, you don't charge them a pet deposit, but if their dog chews up all the baseboards in the unit, they're responsible for that. And yes, I'll make sure to share the slides with everyone, as I said earlier. Can we ask for a letter from their doctor stating they need the service animal without including diagnosis or other medical records? Yes. My suggestion would be to frame it, explain to your resident or potential resident that you need the letter to say that they need what they're asking you for because of their disability. So the letter has to establish a connection between their disability and what they're asking for.